Well, today we are wrapping up our series of talks on marriage. And next week we're starting a brand new series, and we're going to talk about mental health. I'm not sure that we've actually had a series on mental health before, and at least if we do, I can't remember. And so we're going to spend the whole month of March talking about mental health issues. That's a very, very real issue, and the pandemic has certainly not made it any easier. But today, I want to talk about communication. Communication is one of the keys for marriage to work well. And if you have questions during the talk today, don't hesitate to send me a text, and I'll try to answer that. And if you're online, I'll put something online in response to that. Unless it's a very private thing, then just let me know and I'll respond to you just in private. So I know that this is extremely difficult for you to imagine, I'm sure, but when I was a teenager, I actually was terrified of talking to girls. You know, I was convinced that I was ambidextrous, because as soon as a girl came close to me, both of my feet could go into my mouth at the same time. And I'm actually amazed that Shelley was attracted to me at all, because I was just saying the most stupid things, and I was just totally awkward around women. And the reason I say that is because the number one cause of poor communication can actually be summarized in one little word. It's a 4-letter word, and it starts with F, and it's not the one that you're thinking of. It's fear. Fear is the number one reason for communication breakdown. And that's true of all forms of communication. Whether it's international communications between two countries, or it's communication between people groups, or between the government and its people, between organizations or within organizations. But in marriage, fear actually ramps up and blocks communication at a much higher level than any other form of communication, because it's such an intimate relationship. And in that relationship, you have the potential for much greater wounds emotionally. We can hurt each other much more easily and much more deeply within marriage, and that ramps up the level of fear that much more, and the higher the level of fear, the more the communication is likely to break down. And so I want to start today by looking at a passage of Scripture. So this is from 1 John chapter 4. Now, John was actually Jesus' closest friend here on earth. And John actually sometimes refers to himself in the third person as the one Jesus loved. And so that's the level of friendship that they had with one another. And so in 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 19, or 17 rather, we read this: "By this, love is perfected with us, so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment, because just as Jesus is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears punishment has not been perfected in love. We love because he loved us first." So communication breaks down when we are afraid of retaliation if we say the wrong thing. And Jesus basically is saying here that the reason why he came was to remove the fear of retaliation or punishment, or we would say payback, in our relationship or our communication with God. So Jesus came to basically open up the communication channels between us and God. And he did that by removing the fear of punishment. So Jesus took the punishment for our sins upon himself so that we wouldn't need to carry that fear of punishment. So basically Jesus said, look, I am just going to take care of all of that punishment for you so that you can walk with a sense of peace that is over and done with. It's taken care of. And so we can now approach God with a sense of joy, of peace, of confidence, and a sense of real joy, because there's nothing to be afraid of in our relationship with God. And so now we can talk to God openly. We can be honest with God. We don't have to worry that somehow there's going to be something we say that's going to get us in trouble with God. And so this was the essence of the gospel. And all we need to do in order to enter into this kind of fear-free relationship with God is embrace that gift of forgiveness. You know, a few years ago, it was popular to have stickers on your vehicles that said, "No fear." That's the essence of the good news of Jesus. We don't have to have fear anymore in our relationship with God. No fear is really the battle cry, if you will, of Christians. We are free from fear in our relationship with God. And the way you know if you are free, truly free of fear in your relationship with God, is think about your initial reaction when you make a huge mistake with regards to God. If your initial reaction is, oh my goodness, I need to make sure nobody in the church finds out about this. Oh my goodness, I need to make sure God never finds out about this. Oh my goodness, the last place I want to go right now is to church. If that's the case, you know you are still struggling with fear. You haven't fully embraced the freedom from fear that Jesus paid for you. Really, the right response, the true response of a Christian when we mess up should be, oh my, I need to go to God for him to help me. The best place for me to go right now would be to go to church, to go to prayer, to go to the Bible, to ask God for help. So my question to you this morning is, what is your first reaction when you mess up? Is it like one person I talked to a while ago, when I invited them to church, they said, oh my goodness, I would never dare set foot in a church. Lightning would strike me the moment I walked through the door. If that's your response, I have good news for you. You're wrong. That's not who God is. That's the whole reason why Jesus came. But if your response is, oh my goodness, I messed up, I need to get God to help me here, then you have experienced genuine salvation. You have experienced what Jesus wants you to feel. Most of us in marriage want to have open and honest conversations. We long for that kind of safety and trust and openness in our communication. We intuitively know that that's really what marriage should look like. And But when we get scared, we begin to shut down in different ways with each other within the scope of marriage. And for most of us, we don't even realize that we are doing this. It's such a subtle thing, and sometimes we've grown so used to watching our P's and Q's in the way we communicate with people that we just go to our default in our marriage relationship as well. There's a researcher down in Washington State. His name is Dr. John Gottman. Highly respect this man in the area of relationships in particular. And he has developed a theory regarding these ways in which we basically protect ourselves when we are afraid in a relationship. And he has basically summarized them into 4 big categories. And he calls them the 4 horses of the apocalypse, because when we begin hiding in our relationships out of fear, and the communication starts to break down as a result of that, we actually are inviting disaster. So the first one is criticism. Basically, what happens is when we have the attitude of tit for tat in our relationships, we are setting ourselves up for communication breakdown. And it's one of those things where, well, if you're going to say that towards me, then I'm going to say this. Or if you're going to be that way, then I'll be this way. And so we are sort of trying to keep the score even between us and our spouse. And we feel entitled because of what they have said to criticize them in some other way. It's like, well, if you're going to bring that up, then I'll bring this up too. And we are constantly in this tense battle for almost one-upmanship in criticizing one another. And some people do it right then and there. It's like, if you are going to criticize me, then I will criticize you, and they do it right then and there. And as soon as you step into that vicious circle, it shuts down communication. Other people won't do it right then. They act brave in the moment. Okay, I'm going to sit here and take this, even though it's extremely uncomfortable. But then later on, in passive-aggressive ways, their frustration leaks out, and they pay back what they feel was not fair. And so they will make you pay in some other way for being honest with them about your feelings. We call that passive-aggressive behavior. And many people actually don't even realize they're doing it. It just sort of leaks out. And that would have been me. When I was first married in particular, Shelley used to get so frustrated with me because I would do things that were passive-aggressive. And I didn't even know that I was doing it. I was so unaware of my own inner world that I could not recognize that my frustration was leaking out in these different ways. And so Shelley had to help me recognize what I was doing. And gradually, I started to become more and more aware of what was going on inside of me and how I was paying her back, but in roundabout ways. And as I learned, our communication improved over time. So that's the first one, that critical attitude. The second one, that second category that John Gottman talks about is contempt. Contempt sounds very eerie. The interesting thing about contempt is that most of the time, that is actually not something we say, it's more body language. I mean, really. It's ways of communicating with our physical body that communicates, I can't believe you are so stupid. I can't believe that you would actually even think like that. And really, ultimately, what we're saying is, you are really a bad person. I can't believe that I would even give you the time of day with the level of intelligence that you have, the low level of intelligence you have. I mean, why do I even bother? And it's extremely demeaning. It sends the message, you're just a disgusting human being. And that message kills communication. I mean, who wants to be told you are a disgusting human being? Who is up for saying, yes, let's have an open and honest discussion I want to share my heart with you. Because you feel I'm a disgusting human being, it just makes me all warm and fuzzy inside. I just want to be close to you. Of course not. When we communicate that kind of disgust to another person, it automatically deteriorates the value of that whole person, and the communication breaks down. The third area that Dr. John Gottman talks about is defensiveness. Now, you would think if you feel attacked, defending yourself would be a natural reaction. It's something that, I'm not going to let you talk me into something without putting up a fight at the very least. I've got enough dignity and self-respect that I am going to stand up for what I believe. And here's the thing. Anytime you push back on somebody when they are trying to be open and honest with you, you make them feel unsafe in the relationship. See, the problem with defensiveness is that it's a symptom that you are not listening to understand, you are actually listening to respond. You're looking for ways that you can one-up the other person or get back at them or destroy their argument. And so you are not really listening with the heart of saying, what are you really saying here? It's, I am just looking for that opening where I can get you. But love drives us to want to understand, not to defend. True love says, tell me what you really feel. Tell me what you really are saying. Explain to me again. Help me understand. And most often, when people feel fully understood, we can actually agree to disagree and still be friends. But until people feel fully heard, very seldom will they be willing to just let it go and agree to disagree. And I think this is one of the most common problems in marriage. We feel like the other person doesn't really get it, and so we feel like we need to keep trying rather than just accept the fact that it's okay if we have different perspectives on some things. See, when you feel fully heard, you feel safe enough to be able to say, okay, you know what I feel? I'll be willing to listen to what you have to say. And even if we don't agree, we can still be friends because we have that level of respect in a relationship. And the last category that John Gottman talks about is stonewalling. And this is the worst, the most damaging for communication to really continue in a healthy way. It actually breaks down communication completely. So stonewalling is when you just check out. And there's different ways of doing that. You can actually literally walk away. Some people do that. Some people, just get their technology out and they're just, focused on whatever, and it's like, yeah, whatever. That's stonewalling as well. It can be just refusing to take somebody seriously, where, you're just joking around and making light of what they're saying. There's a number of different ways that you can stonewall, but bottom line is you're not really engaging with the other person at all. Our young people do something they call ghosting now. Ghosting is another form of stonewalling, where you're just not responding anymore. So in marriage, we don't usually start off with bad communication. Usually when we start in marriage, we feel safe and we communicate well because of that. And that's one of the things that makes marriage attractive. It's one of the things that love relationships are so enticing or intoxicating, because when we feel like we can be ourselves completely, it just draws us right in there. But one of the reasons why that happens is because when our relationships are new, we don't really know the other person's no-go zones. If you think of this aisle right here as being just a very narrow little space, and those are the no-go zones when you first get married. We don't talk about those because those are a little bit sensitive. Over time, often that zone gets wider and wider and wider. And we realize there's actually more areas where we don't go, more things we don't talk about, more things that are sensitive, more things where we get negative pushback in some way, shape, or form when we talk about those things. And so the areas that we don't feel comfortable really talking about often get bigger and bigger, or seem to get bigger. They were always there, but when we were first in love, we hid them in different ways. But over time, they become more and more obvious. And so we find that there's less and less area in our relationship that is safe zone. And so as a result of that, there's less and less things we can actually comfortably talk about in our relationship. And so our relationships become more and more shallow and more distant over time. And we just kind of walk on eggshells around each other. Or it can go in the other direction. One or both of you decide, I don't care. I am just going to talk anyway. I am just going to be honest and tell it the way I see it anyway, whether you like it or not. And we become bulldozers in our relationships. And often that just creates more and more damage as well. And we think, well, yeah, but at least our relationship is open and honest. But it's damaging the relationship in the process. So either way, whether you walk on eggshells or you do the bulldozer thing, either way, you're damaging the relationship. A guy named Jared Bias says this: for some reason, in my experience, when the phrase "speaking the truth in love," and that's a phrase from the Bible, it's actually in the book of Ephesians, chapter 4. And Christians often use that when they're bulldozing. And so he says, when the phrase "speaking the truth in love" is used, rarely does the person hearing it feel loved. Instead, it's most often used as a way to convince someone that they are being loved, even when it doesn't feel that way. It's not often used of someone heavily invested in collaborating with someone in their struggle, but as a way to lob hurtful opinions, walk away, and feel guilt-free. Wow. So really, we say that to make ourselves feel better. So how does love really change the situation? Jesus came to open the door for us to experience love. We talked about that at the beginning. that love drives out fear. But what does that look like at a really practical level? I mean, all of this theory stuff is okay to us, but just give me the bottom line. What does this mean for the way I talk to my spouse? Well, let's look at how Jesus communicated. I think he's the ultimate role model for good communication. In the Gospels, Jesus was asked 183 questions. Do you realize that out of those 183 questions, he only responded directly 3 times? Now, wait a minute, husbands, all of you that are saying, see, that's why I don't answer your questions. That's why I don't talk. That's not what was going on here. Instead, Jesus responded with curiosity. Jesus actually responded to those 183 questions with 307 questions of his own. When people came to Jesus and asked him a question, Jesus was always wanting to dig deeper, to understand better where the person was coming from. That's what love looks like. When people come, when your spouse comes to you and wants to communicate, you fully engage by asking good questions, asking them to explain more. And it's as simple as saying, tell me more. How many of you spouses would actually feel put off if your spouse responded to you by saying, tell me more? That's a wonderful invitation to good communication, isn't it? It's a loving way to respond. Jesus was actually profoundly curious. And that's what love looks like in a relationship. Love is profoundly curious. It's always wanting to understand the other person better. Always wanting to know more about them and where they're coming from. Now, this takes profound inner security, and that's one of the reasons why we shy away from this. Because we have to know where we stand ourselves so that we can avoid any one of those 4 things that we talked about earlier. So that we don't get defensive, so that we don't get critical or contemptuous or stonewall, which is very easy to go there. Instead, we need to have that open sense of, wow, that's an interesting perspective. Tell me more. When we feel easily threatened, we do these other things to try to escape the situation and to shut the other person down rather than to open up to further communication. And basically what we're saying to them, and then often the way they respond is, I need you to agree with me. And as soon as I need you to agree with me is the essence of our communication starts to break down. But when we have the inner security to say, that is very interesting. Tell me more. Now, all of a sudden, I've opened the door to a whole new realm. Jared, the fellow I quoted a minute ago, he says this, it feels good to convince people you are right because it helps stuff down your own self-doubt. I have found that the more important it is for me to convince someone else that I'm right about something, the more I realize it's me I'm trying to convince. For me, when I enter a conversation feeling insecure or want to be right, it won't usually end with me loving the other person well. Interesting. Love says, I know who I am, and I don't need to defend myself. Jesus is my defender. but I do want to learn more about you. So I'm really curious to find out how you see things and why you see things that way. And that attitude leads to really good communication in marriage. That attitude leads to really good communication with your kids. Imagine the many times that we as parents go, just because I said so, rather than saying, that's an interesting perspective. Tell me more. Where are you coming from here? Just think of how that would affect our friendships and other relationships as well. You know, I really want to be a church like this. That is what my heart is. A church that's curious. So there's a church in Toronto named the Meeting House. And they have started in the last few years having meetings once or twice a year that they call ears to hear meetings. It's kind of a different kind of a concept, but it's really captured my imagination. So what they do is they have a meeting where the microphone is not pointed towards the pastor, but actually is down in the congregation. And they invite a certain group of people that are underrepresented in the leadership of the church to have the floor at that meeting. So the idea is that they choose a particular group of people for each one of these meetings. So the first one they chose was women in leadership. Basically, the church leaders realized that we don't have very many leaders in our church that are women. And they don't have much of a voice at the leadership table. So we need to listen to them. So they had a meeting where they said, if you're a woman in particular, and a woman in leadership in particular, we want to hear your perspective. How do you experience the world? How do you experience our church? How do you experience what we teach? And so they listened, and there was no rebuttals allowed. There was no debate allowed. They just listened. The second one that they had was people struggling with mental health issues. They invited people with mental health issues to explain their world to the leadership and the rest of the church, because they realized that was an underrepresented group in the leadership. The third one that they did was people with disabilities. They invited them to talk about their experienced reality. Loving people involves listening with curiosity, with an open heart.